Fawkes, the historical Christian fantasy novel by Nadine Brandes, is bad historical fantasy and problematic as Christian fiction. Whatever it might do well at a higher level, it fails at its genre premise. We'll look at that today, and we'll look at the steps necessary to keep ourselves from also making those mistakes. So firstly, Fawkes' historical fantasy. Historical fantasy can be very broadly, please bear with me here in my lack of nuance, it can be broadly described in terms of secret history or of alternate history. In secret history, ordinary people usually have the same understanding of history as us in the real world, but there's another magical or supernatural layer underneath it. For example, Abraham Lincoln, vampire hunter, in it, the events of the Civil War still occurred as we understand them today, but in the book, vampires exist and are the driving reason for Lincoln's entire career. This might raise the question of where the difference lies between historical fantasy and something like Harry Potter and the Dresden Files, which have secret magical worlds underneath what is supposed to be our own world. Though genre lines are a little bit foggy, I think something is considered historical fantasy when it focuses on a specific historical person, place, event, or series of events. A fantasy novel that takes place in Edwardian England but doesn't engage with the setting very much might be considered fantasy, with a historically inspired setting rather than historical fantasy. Maybe. Feel free to correct me if you are way more knowledgeable of the tropes of historical fiction than I am. In secret history, a secret world lurks underneath our own mundane world and ordinary people are none the wiser. A very common alternative to this is alternate history, in which history progressed as it does in our own world up to a certain point, at which something important changed and the course of history was altered. For a few reasons, some of them unfortunate, two of the most common questions asked by amateur writers of alternate history, in my experience at least, are what if the South won the American Civil War, and what if the Nazis won World War II? The Man in the High Castle is a particularly well-known example of that second one. This event where everything changes in alternate history is called the point of divergence. In alternate historical fantasy, this is usually the moment magic or the supernatural influences the world for the first time in a meaningful way in this timeline. Sometimes this is when the hidden world of a secret history stops hiding in the shadows, it stops being secret, and it takes a side in something like a war. Sometimes this is when magic of some kind is discovered. After the point of divergence, as you might imagine, the shift in worldview and the balance of military and political power changes the interactions of world powers, and sometimes tips delicately balanced events into something different than we read in our history books today. Once one event changes, as you might imagine, the further history of the world follows this new chain of cause and effect. As a brief and shallow example, World War II wouldn't have happened if the Central Powers had won World War I. Fawkes is alternate historical Christian fantasy. Ignoring the Christian aspect of that for the moment, it's alternate historical fantasy. It takes place in an alternate 1605 England in which the conflict which provoked the Gunpowder Plot was not between two factions of Christianity, but between two factions of a magic system. Where, then, is the point of divergence in Fawkes? It doesn't seem to have one. Fawkes is the story of the Gunpowder Plot as told by Guy Fawkes's maybe fictional son Thomas. In this world, there are people who can use a magic system called color power. A parent who possesses color power can make a mask for their kid when they reach puberty, and the kid puts this mask on and gains the ability to telekinetically control objects which are of one color that they have bonded with. They also hear the voice of white light in their head, urging them to give in and embrace the ability to use every color. Two sects exist in this world regarding color power. The Igniters, who believe you should give in to this voice, and the Keepers, who tell their kids that the power of white light is a power mortals were not meant to have and that they must resist and ignore it. Igniters are analogous to Protestants, and Keepers are analogous to Catholics in the year 1605. By analogous, I mean the original Guy Fawkes story was about a Catholic terrorist trying to blow up Parliament, in large part because of the persecution of Catholics by the Protestant King of England at the time. And also the Igniters were founded by a guy named Luther. In comparison, the story of Fawkes is about a keeper terrorist trying to blow up Parliament, in large part because of the persecution of keepers by igniters in England at the time. The politics of the two sects of Christianity are simply replaced with the two sects of magic in this world. In this world, lots of people have color power and use it in their daily lives. In the very first chapter, a green power-wielding doctor uses green-colored tools to mix medicine for Thomas, our main character. And lots of random townsfolk, it seems anyone who isn't an absolute beggar, uses color power to perform their work as best as they can. This raises two huge issues, which both stem from what seems for all the world like not thinking everything through. And this is the problem I have with Fawkes. The world building feels slapped onto the story for the sake of being really cool, which it certainly is, and without care for verisimilitude. Remember the point of divergence that we mentioned earlier. If Catholics and Protestants have been replaced with magic users, then the history of Christianity has either been completely replaced with a system which has happened to lead us to the exact same situation as in our real world at this time and place, or every action which ever was associated with Christianity throughout history has been replaced with an analogous action relating to this magic system. The author, Nadine Brandes, is Christian herself, and her testimony on her blog leads me to believe she probably holds a literal view of history as described in the Bible. I don't think I'm putting too many words in her mouth when I assume that she believes, for example, that Adam and Eve were the first humans and that Moses parted the Red Sea. But what about in the alternate history of Fawkes? Did Adam and Eve have color power? Did Moses? It sounds like this, as we hear that in ancient times, white light spoke to people directly before keepers mucked everything up. There are huge portions of the Old Testament in our history where the real power of God's prophets are described winning over the trickery or outright impotence of pagan priests. In the Fawkes world, did any of those other priests have any kind of color power also, in the same way that outright villains in Fawkes have color power? Or, to fit in with the Christian parallel, did only the ancient Hebrews have color power? Is it possible that in a situation like this didn't change the flow of history at all? That goes for the rest of history, backward and forward. What about the Ottoman-Habsburg Wars? Is there an Islamic analog to color power? Or are they still just a religion while Christians have been replaced with wizards? There's one last problematic detail as it relates to Fawkes being Christian fiction, but we'll put a pin in that for the moment. The bizarre thing is, in the history of Fawkes, that the details feel authentic and really atmospheric. Brandes does an amazing job writing characters who are not thoroughly unlikable despite being products of their time, and she doesn't fall into the trap I see many YA historical authors fall into, where they give their characters all these modern-day sensibilities for no good reason aside from just wanting to make them likable to young readers. The London that Brandes writes feels very authentic and would be awesome if it was supposed to take place in our own England. But even if we ignore all the other historical issues that we've mentioned, the fact that color power exists in Brandes' London means that it shouldn't feel like ours. Color power is weird. I had a hard time on my first couple read-throughs pinning down how it actually works. I mentioned that your parent must make you a mask, and that white light whispers in your head and gives you command over a single color. Be that as it may, it's a little difficult figuring out what counts as an object being a color. In our world, it wasn't for more than 50 years after the events of the Gunpowder Plot that Isaac Newton discovered that light is comprised of many colors. Bring us forward to the modern day, and every school child learns that objects appear to be colored to us because their surfaces absorb most frequencies of light and reflect only certain frequencies in different combinations. A red apple reflects almost only red light, for example. There are three possible explanations to consider for what counts as color in the Fawkes world, and we'll use red as our case. First, a surface is red if it would reflect mostly red light were full spectrum light shown upon it. Second, a surface is red at every moment at which mostly red light is reflecting off it. Third, a surface is red for each person who believes it to be red. Some color power users, such as Guy Fawkes himself, are called Judases, or black color power users. Judases are considered exceptionally dangerous at night because, apparently, everything is black. Since the physical surfaces of the objects are not changing from day to night in a way meaningful to this discussion, it's unlikely that our first case, that we always assume full spectrum light is shining on something is true. That one's unlikely. That still leaves us with two options. Is a surface considered colored when it happens to reflect a certain kind of light, or is it considered colored when a person believes it to be that color? As it happens, black objects don't usually exist in practical reality. Blackness is the absence of light, and most things which seem black to us are actually a very dark shade of red or blue or green. They reflect a tiny bit of color, but hardly enough for us to notice with our naked eye. Assuming Fawkes was based on a modern understanding of optics is a giant stretch, so I'm not confident in ignoring our second use case just based on this. Well, maybe the difference between our last two cases are more philosophical than practical. Colorblind people, as best as I can tell, don't appear in the narrative of Fawkes, and we don't deal with any madmen who for some reason see all things as purple. So for all intents and purposes, a person who looks at an object which appears red, and a person who believes that object to be red, will in fact be the same person. If that's true, London in common life should exist in a manner consistent with the fact that a huge portion of its citizenry have telekinetic control over things of various colors. 12 years before Nadine Brandes published Fawkes, Brandon Sanderson published Mistborn, a book with many similarities to Fawkes, which involves, among other things, a city and society tailor-made for the magic system core to that book. In Mistborn, everything from fashion to architecture to the ways military members are trained revolves around the fact that the world's magic users exist and must be reckoned with on a day-to-day basis. Brandes' London should be the same. The one color no one can control is white, so everything in London that carries any degree of importance to it should likewise be white. Otherwise, you're asking for people to pick your pockets and your locks, to trip you, to freeze your sword in its scabbard, to climb your house or your fence, to shove your hat down over your eyes, to undo your buttons, and to generally make a fool of you. The king should create a monopoly on a single color and recruit or kill everyone who is primarily able to use that color. Guards should carry lanterns with colored glass to cast light on things that only they can control. People should carry paint and powder dye to throw at people and objects in emergencies. It should be a consideration of daily life, but it simply isn't. Fawkes has strength in its prose, in its characterization, and in the details of historical London which filled it to the brim, and if it were only historical fiction, it would succeed, I believe, as strong historical fiction, but that isn't all it is. As historical fantasy, it fails because it simply doesn't integrate the fantasy into its history. The fantasy doesn't inform or reframe the history. It doesn't ask us any what-if questions. This would have been a better book if it had been pure historical fiction exploring the Gunpowder Plot from the angle of Guy Fawkes' son. But once again, that's not all it is. It's not only historical fiction, it's not only historical fantasy, it is historical Christian fantasy. As a book for Christians, I find Fawkes disturbingly problematic, and I find it weird that I seem to be the only person to have come to this conclusion. Jesus is analogous for white light. White light comes to you in adolescence and whispers in your mind, asking you to give yourself to him and to accept the glorious freedom of manipulation of more than one color. A guy named Luther even created the Igniters, the Protestant sect equivalent. This is a world where color power takes the place of Christianity. And yet, Christianity still seems to exist. There are mentions of churches. Quote, St. Helen, St. Andrew, St. Dunstan, I was in the tower of St. Olaf Church, unquote, page 96. Quote, as I turned up another wider alleyway, the church bells rang, unquote, page 131. The existence of churches could point to formal religion based on color power, of course, even though our characters never formally worship over the course of the story. Keeper philosophy is referred to as a faith, after all, so let's look further. Quote, God rest their souls, unquote, page 274. Quote, God save King Philip, unquote, page 285. God is generic and could mean anything, so we must go one step further. Christmas is mentioned 10 times between chapters 19 and 27, and of course Guy Fawkes refers to himself as a Judas several times. So Jesus and Christianity do seem to exist in this world. They exist alongside a magic system which takes the meaning they held in our timeline, and in the world of Fawkes, Jesus exists, but white light saves. Though I'm certain she didn't intend it, by her careless world building, Nadine Brandes stripped Christianity in her own world of its meaning and validity. So what do we take from this? Nadine Brandes did an interview with StoryEmbers.com in which she described her creative process through Fawkes' creation, and described how when she started writing Fawkes, historical fantasy in the young adult space was still very new, and moreover that she had little to no familiarity with the historical fantasy genre at that time. There's a huge danger in writing in a genre you're not familiar with. This isn't a particular weakness I noticed in Fawkes, but I've critiqued countless manuscripts in which someone with only a surface-level understanding of a certain genre decided they wanted to revolutionize it, and in response made strange and baffling story choices. Someone only familiar with Clint Eastwood's anti-westerns would probably not try to revolutionize the western genre as a whole. Likewise, historical fantasy requires a person to understand the concepts of alternate and secret history, of the point of divergence, of the consequences of replacing some of the meaning of a historical element while allowing others to remain. When you want to write in a genre, you must ask yourself why that genre in particular. Are you willing to do the extra research required to make your historical fiction also fantasy, or to set your fantasy story in a historically based environment? After you decide, make sure you build an understanding of the history of the genre. Read the classics and the modern entries to the genre that are particularly popular. Find the common pitfalls of your competition and strive to avoid those pitfalls. Find the heart of your genre, the reason people choose this genre over others. And don't betray your readers' fundamental genre expectations. Get beta readers from your genre to give you feedback. And know that in the end, actively good storytelling is not enough. You must avoid inconsistency, confusion, and unfortunate implications if you want that active goodness to shine.